Okay, my job here is sort of very simple. I'm here for just a few minutes to make use of this immense privilege to introduce to you Colin Thubron. For those of us who dabble in travel writing occasionally, Colin is sort of an institution, not just for the sheer elegance of his prose and the insights that he brings, but also sort of the model of the traveler and the travel writer that he has sort of embodied throughout his career. It's a kind of model that is a grand romantic ideal in one sense. It's the sort of person who travels essentially without a return ticket. Somebody goes away for weeks or even months, immerses himself in the cultures and the languages, learns, in fact, some of the languages as he travels, and then comes back and distills his thoughts and his experiences into this wonderful, wonderful prose. And in this model, he has sort of traveled through Syria, which is personally my favorite book, Lebanon, the Soviet Union, China, at a time when China was not sort of as open as it is today for travel. And today he's going to talk to us about his book, To a Mountain in Tibet, with the mountain at the heart of this is Mount Kailash. And I think perhaps more so than most of Colin's other books, To a Mountain in Tibet is as much about what he's seeing on the outside and experiencing as it is about what he's feeling on the inside. He goes to Tibet shortly after the passing of his mother, and there are beautiful passages about life and loss that mirror sort of the beauty and the starkness of the surroundings that he's in. So Colin is going to talk, I think, for 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience as well. I think over to you, Colin.
Thank you so much. That's fine. Can I be heard? Yes. Oh, bad luck. Well, thank you. Well, I must start both with a warning and an apology. The apology is that I'm going to be talking about a journey to Mount Kailash in Tibet, which of course is sacred to Hindus as well as to Buddhists. So there are those of you here, I'm sure, that will know much more about it than I do. The warning comes in the words of the writer Dorothy Sayers, who had this to say about meeting her fellow authors. What we make is more important than what we are, particularly if making is our profession. People are always imagining that if only they can get hold of the author and, so to speak, shake him long enough and hard enough, something illuminating and interesting will drop out of him. But it doesn't. Or in the terser words of Margaret Atwood, if you like pate, don't bother to meet the duck. Well, in the most sacred of Hindu scriptures, as many of you will know, more than 2,000 years ago, there appears a mystic mountain. It rotates at the axis of all creation, going countless miles up to the palace of Brahma and plunging deep beneath the earth. From this sacred mountain flow mystically the four rivers that nourish the earth, and everything created, rocks, trees, humans, has its blueprint, as it were, on the slopes of this mystical mountain. In time, this mountain became associated with one which was real, a geographical mountain, the earthly Kailash, which is a mountain of extraordinary isolated beauty, separated in a way from the main body of the Himalayas, almost as if by divine intent, and now in Tibet. And early wanderers to the four great rivers of the Indian subcontinent, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Sutlej, the Indus, found to their astonishment that all those four rivers had their source at cardinal points of Mount Kailash. It was indeed as if those wanderers had discovered the heart of the world. It's a site that has, of course, been controversial because it's in Tibet, and yet it's venerated by Hindus and by Buddhists of all nations. In other words, 1/5 of humankind regards this mountain as the heart of the world. So sacrosanct, in fact, that nobody's ever climbed it. It's never been climbed. It's unknown when the first pilgrims came there, but soon blessings were accruing to them in sacred lore that increased marvelously with time. In fact, in a single circuit of the mountain, it was supposed, it would expunge the sins of a whole lifetime. In legend, the Buddha himself arrived here and nailed Kailash to earth before it could be taken off by a demon. Meanwhile, Hindus believe the summit to be the palace of Shiva, who sits there in eternal meditation. Yet the god of death dwells on the mountain too. Nothing is total, nothing is permanent, not even him. My own motive for traveling to this mountain has a dark undertow. The Swiss writer Nicolas Bouvier wrote that you think you are making a journey, but soon it is making you. And I was on a kind of oblique pilgrimage of my own. People have often seen in pilgrimage something more complex, certainly, than those of simple motives of simple piety or repentance. By walking closer to the earth and slowing down, there's a feeling of something more visceral going on. And there's an idea that walking is a kind of ritual in itself. Above all, do not lose your desire to walk, wrote Kierkegaard. I have walked myself into my best thoughts. By sitting still, the closer one comes to feeling ill. Thus, if one keeps on walking, everything will be all right. And a mountain in particular is potent, of course. To be ascending in so many cultures is to be drawing closer to the divine, whether it's the Greek paganism of Mount Olympus or the Hindu Himalaya. Robert Macfarlane writes that the equation of height with goodness is embedded in our language and consequently in the way we think. We move up or we sink down. One does not, by any linguistic circumstances, progress down. Although not always. One anonymous dissenter does remark that when a man's circumference bears more than a certain ratio to his altitude, he prefers the plains. Well, most of us in Europe are prisoners of that private faith that's called the sublime. In Europe, mountains often were images of dread at an early period. In fact, in the 16th and 17th centuries, we find accounts of travelers crossing the Alps, and they would literally go blindfold so that they wouldn't be made dizzy by the horrors around them. But then, by the late 18th century, we find attitudes changing, and it became quite common to read God's grandeur into mountains. They became, as it were, objects of secular worship. And I suppose I was following just such a trajectory, following the great valley of the Karnali River in western Nepal over to the sacred mountain in Tibet. My motive can hardly be made logical. It was a journey spurred by the death of the last of my family. There's nothing obviously unusual in a man of my age having no family left. But the journey was something I felt compelled to do. I wasn't actually sure that even that a book was going to arise from it. And I'll read you this very visceral motive because it's too complex and perhaps a little too painful to try to speak it otherwise. But my Sherpa, who I had with me, asked me, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "traveling alone." And I find I cannot answer. But sometimes journeys begin long before their first step is taken. Mine, without my knowing, starts not long ago in a hospital ward as the last of my family dies. There's nothing strange in this, the state of being alone. The death of parents may bring resigned sadness, even a guilty freedom. Instead, I need to leave a sign of their passage. My mother died just now, it seems, not in the way she wished. My father before her, my sister before that, at the age of 21. The Sherpa's eyes stay mute on me, puzzled. Solitude here is an unsought peril. I joke, Nobody's stupid enough to travel with me. It's already evening. Our feet grate over the stones. You cannot walk out your grief, I know, or absolve yourself of your survival, or bring anyone back. You are left with the desire only that things not be as they are. So you choose somewhere meaningful on the earth's surface, as if planning a secular pilgrimage. Yet the meaning is not your own. Then you go on a journey. It's my profession, after all, walking to a place beyond your own history, to the sound of the river flowing the other way. In the end, you come to rest at a mountain that is holy to others. To ask of a journey why is to hear only my own silence. It's the wrong question, although there seems no other. Am I harrowing myself because the world is mortal? Whose pain am I purging? Not theirs. An old Tibetan monk tells me that the soul has no memory. The dead do not feel their past. Meanwhile, the sun is setting with a perverse radiance behind us. Imagine then Nepal, the Himalayas, Nepal, and in the far northwest of it, a very remote part, so remote in fact that there are no roads at all. You get a little twin otter aircraft, as I did, which lands you in a small town called Simikot, and there, in the rather large-like tradition that still prevails in parts of the Himalayas, I hired the minimum retinue I would have. It's a Sherpa and a horseman, and then made my way up the Kanali Valley, staying with Hindu and Buddhist families along the way. The trees are enormous here, vast firs and hemlocks, perhaps 150 feet above you sometimes. And curiously, for an English person, full of sounds that might be heard in English gardens, cuckoos and woodpeckers. It's a beautiful, densely forested valley in its beginnings. But of course, this area was the one that was plagued by Maoist guerrillas who inflicted 13,000 deaths on the Nepalese before they were finally coerced into attempting to share the government. The only danger, I was told here by my Sherpa, was a rather curious one. We were approaching a village, and he said, I said, let's stay here for the night. And he said, we stay here, you die here. I said, die here? Why should I die here? Everybody seems quite peaceful. He said, I did not say die here. I said, you will diarrhea. Well, we did diarrhea, of course. And soon afterwards came the beautiful transition into the Tibetan world, the Tibetan Buddhist world, from the Hindu. You'll find suddenly on the roofs of the villages, prayer flags are flying. Those flags which are supposed to be disseminated by the wind, all the prayers written on them for the good of all sensate beings. And then you come across mani walls, which are inscribed. They're not walls at all. They're really sort of long, perhaps 6 foot high embankments, which may go on for quite a way, and they're entirely composed of stones with inscribed prayers on them. And they believe that if you circumambulate that wall, it will activate all those prayers again for the good of mankind. I was ascending by now into an area that was more eroded and bleak, and crossed into Tibet at 13,000 feet. And there, even though this is just a footpath, you are met by the Chinese. Chinese officials looking very smart, very polite. They clearly, their whole bearing seems to be telling you that they are bringing civilization to this country. They are bringing all the infrastructures of education and medicine to a land, the Tibetans, that they have been brought up to believe is just a sink of feudal serfdom, really. A life expectation of 36, people who they believe to be drunk and illiterate and insanitary. They don't understand, it seems, that by suppressing the religion in Tibet. They are destroying the country's heart. Finally, after numberless searches and regulations, I was allowed by the Chinese to continue. And the last thing I had to do was fill out a long questionnaire. The last question, because I was now in a tent where they were monitoring people for swine fever, it said, the last rather pedantic questionnaire, have you had close relations with pig during 1 week? Well, at last you move into Tibet after being cleared of a friendship with a pig. And it's a beautiful, strange upland, a violet-tinged landscape of extraordinary, strange enormousness and beauty. A country, nevertheless, that seems fearsomely solitary. You're now almost 3 miles above sea level. I think that, like most Westerners traveling to Tibet, I was the inheritor of a very powerful and confused mystique. In the 19th century, Western travelers certainly were only allowed to enter the country either in disguise, they only went in disguise, or at some danger with subterfuge. And Tibet in time became rumored as a place of occult miracles, where the paranormal was almost studied as a science, it was imagined, in the West. So Tibet became a kind of an unknown, a curious unknown. There were monks there, it was said, who performed great feats of sonic power and telepathy. The yogis could levitate and fly. There were the strange Lungpa, the windmen, whose feet barely touched the landscape as they walked, they simply drifted across it, and so on. And that mystique touched even Rudyard Kipling's Kim, for instance, and Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, who took refuge in Tibet, supposedly, after he was apparently killed. The one country nobody had recognized Sherlock Holmes in was apparently Tibet. And this fantasy of Tibet continued far into the 20th century. As the West reeled through 2 world wars, the last strictures on Tibet faded away. It became a site of pure human longing. The name Shangri-La entered the language after James Hilton wrote a novel on Tibet called The Lost Horizon. This was published in 1933, and he imagined it, Tibet, inhabited by an echelon of seers, of holy men, who were going to redeem the world after its self-destruction. And the country's Buddhism, which all through the 19th century was considered a rather depraved kind of lost version of Buddhism, a sort of a cousin of the original that had somehow gone astray. It was suddenly conceived instead as the refined pinnacle of Buddhism, of a very developed faith which had been embalmed by the isolation of Tibet. Time, as it were, had stopped here. But it wasn't always so. The reality of Tibet was often quite violent. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Tibetan Empire was so formidable that it sacked the great Tang dynasty city of Xi'an, and their armies reached to the borders of Burma. They were able to muster 200,000 men within a few weeks, and their armor was considered the finest in the world. And this strange anomaly, as we might probably see it now, continued well into the time when Tibet became filled with monasteries. I mean, in the 14th, 15th centuries, there were tremendous civil wars going on between the Tibetan monasteries, each with its own agenda. And the Dalai Lamas, even when the Dalai Lamas weren't murdered in infancy, they were often complicit in violence, even into the 20th century, the early 20th century. Monks, even now in Tibet, are the spearhead of revolt. We're familiar with this in the news, that it's monks that are protesting, and monks that are often being harassed and arrested. When I told this to a friendly monk I knew in Kathmandu, a Buddhist Tibetan. He said, well, you get us wrong, he said. You in the West, you imagine monks are all pacifists and we're all gentle. He said, we're not. We're very passionate, Tibetan monks in particular. He said, we feel very strongly and we get out of control. He said to me, he said, only last night, he said, you should have seen the monks watching television, and they got terribly worked up. Apparently the monks were all followers of Manchester United, and they were furious because penalty tickets were being given out unfairly, they said, by the referee, and they were throwing things at the screen and shouting. And I said, monks watching football, I said, I thought that the monks were meditating in the evening or praying. And he said, well, you know, perhaps it is a kind of meditation. He said, they concentrate on the ball, and the rest of the world goes away. Well, my first sighting of Mount Kailash was of a great dome floating above a lake of brilliant blue. This was the lake Rakashtal, the lake of demons, which flows into a more larger and more beautiful lake called Manasarovar. This lake seems almost to be carved out of the plateau like a bit of abstract sculpture. And again, as Kailash has never been climbed, so this lake, you're forbidden to fish in it, you're forbidden to swim in it, forbidden by sacred law. And nobody can have a boat on it, nothing. And so everything around that lake has never been hunted. You find the birds, Brahmani ducks, black-headed gulls, grebes, fringing the whole lake, 54 miles in circumference. It's the highest lake at 15,000 feet of that size in the world, and full of these virtually tame birds which you almost have to kick out of the way as you walk along it. It's a lake that to Hindus was created by the mind of God. It's, in other words, it's the flower of first consciousness. Sometimes Shiva floats here in the guise of a golden swan. And it was in these waters of great purity, that the Buddha's mother came to bathe when she was giving birth to him. And there were a few monasteries around it, anciently, but always very small. All of them had been demolished in the Cultural Revolution, but now 6 of them had returned. And when I went to them, they were tiny, humble places. And I can remember reading an account of a century ago in which clearly they were always tiny. This account said there was just one monk in this remote monastery, one monk left, who would sound a great bronze bell over the waters that was heard by nobody at all. Beside the lake, I find Hermit Caves, and there was still evidence of hermits who had gone there in an old Tibetan tradition to meditate. And this tantric practice, as it is, of course, was inherited from India in the 8th century and became the fulcrum, the heart of Tibetan Buddhism, what they called the Vajrayana, or the thunderbolt, or diamond vehicle, by which they imagined ascend to nirvana within a single lifetime of very dangerous, in some ways, meditation. That's a scandalously short period, of course, to a conventional Buddhist, that you can attain nirvana in a lifetime. But I went into some of these little sanctuaries. The hermits were gone, but 1 or 2 had recently been there. One could see bags of salt, little stoves, 1 or 2 scriptures discarded there. And 1 or 2 looked as if they'd been vacated just a few months before. But as I approached Kailash itself, I came across a very different sort of worship. It was the Buddhist festival of Saga Dawa. And there's an enormous pole in a valley underneath Kailash, which, if the Tibetans manage to elevate it, it's prostrate most of the time. If they elevate it on Saga Dawa and it remains built upright, it's a good sign for the coming year. If it leans or totters, it's an evil omen. And this enormous 80-foot pole, I believe, is a very ancient leftover of a feeling in Tibet that once heaven and earth were joined together. It's reflected in the myths of the early Tibetan kings, who imagined that they descended from heaven by cords of light attached to their heads. And the ceremony, I think, is a very old one of loss, of the severance of earth from heaven, which adds another strain to that death-conscious side of the Tibetan religion. When I arrived there, the Chinese had penetrated the valley, and there's some 200 soldiers monitoring this ceremony. And I've never seen people ignore one another to the degree these two were doing, as if the Tibetans were simply seeing straight through them. They were gazing on Mount Kailash, they were gazing on the pole, and it was as if the soldiers, who were quite boisterously parading with batons and riot shields, quite unnecessary, they were not apparently conscious of. Up on the plateau above this was a place for sky burial. And I'm sure, as some of you know, this was the way, and still is the way, by which the Tibetans will often dispose of their dead. It's the preferred way of death is for the body to be cut up and the corpse by somebody called a sky burial master. The bones are then pulverized and fed to vultures. These birds are sacred in Tibetan law. It's said that they only defecate in the sky, and in death their bodies don't fall to earth all of a piece, but they go on, the bird goes on flying upwards towards the sun until the wind takes it apart. On this plateau above the valley, people had left really tributes to the god of death as a sign to look favorably on them in their passing. So there was a woman's silk waistcoat, there were child's toys, there was a bitter wind going across, and vulture feathers. And I saw a man, a yogi or a shaman, I suppose, who was rolling in the dust there, on and on, invoking, I think, the Gompas, the lords of the cemetery, that they should really devour his ego. This was the idea, and so hurry him on to salvation. The ascent of mountains in many cultures, from ancient Egypt to Aboriginal Australia, means death. The mountain road is the path of the dead. The Assyrian word to die is to clutch the mountain. In fact, Japanese funeral processions, even today, start out by saying Yamaguki, we go to the mountain. And as many as you will know, I know, the Hindu saying, to depart for Kailash is a synonym for dying. Hindu and Buddhist pilgrims circle the mountain clockwise. They go to accrue merit, to cleanse sins, and for earthly blessings, sometimes very practical blessings, maybe the carving another yak or the birth of a son or better price for their butter. And it's said that a single circuit of the mountain will dispel even the murder of a lama or a parent. In the past, the rich sometimes paid a proxy to go around the mountain for them and divided the merit half and half. And even now, if a pilgrim goes around riding a horse or a yak, half the merit goes to the beast. It's some 33 miles in circuit, and it takes 3 or 4 days for most people to go around. For Tibetans, just 36 hours, they're so used to that altitude. And some go around prostrating themselves all the way, and that takes a month, just a ritual prostration all the way around the mountain. When I arrived and hoped to find some mode of transport to go around, I was told in the little station at the foot of the mountain, they said, we've run out of yaks. So there were no yaks, and my Sherpa and I simply shouldered a single tent and went off alone. The mountain, which looks from a distance as if it's almost circular, is in fact a wonderful pyramid. The northern face is a sheer drop of 5,000 feet of virtually sheer ice and rock. A terrible thing to look on, but in a way awesomely beautiful. The average pilgrim experience here is not actually an esoteric one. It's very raw. The whole zone for these pilgrims, Tibetans in particular, is charged with a kind of sanctity. The summit of Kailash is supposed to be the seat of Demchog, who's a furious Buddhist deity. And the whole mountain is resonating with holiness. The rocks are considered to be alive. The peaks along the valley are all residences of various Buddha deities. And every oddity of crag or boulder is something's ascribed to it, some holy feat. There are caves there, which used to be where hermits had meditated. And those caves are still said to be alive with the numen, the power of the hermits who once dwelt there. The footprints of saints and hermits and of the Buddha himself are all around the mountain. The surviving Bon, which is the oldest of the Tibetan religions, circle the mountain the other way. They go anti-clockwise. And then there are followers of the peaceful Jain sect who reverence the mountain because they believe it to be the site where their first prophet passed away. Hindu pilgrims see a landscape of their own, sometimes overlapping with the Buddhist. But I was surprised to see many coming down anti-clockwise. I imagined they were Bon to begin with, but no, there were Indians who had failed to reach the pass around the mountain. They looked dispirited, and they were riding horses, carrying little canisters of oxygen, discarding them into the rocks. And I realized that most of these who had failed to make the mountain pass, which is almost 19,000 feet, they came from lowland parts of India, maybe from the southern plains, from Mumbai, Chennai, and they hadn't realized what they were going to. And I think unscrupulous tour operators had told them it was much easier than it was. And after all, you fly up to Kathmandu, and then that's when you go on from Kathmandu, you're flown on to Lhasa, which is another 8,000 feet. Then you cross Tibet to the Lake Manasarovar, up to 15,000 feet. And these poor people had been fooled, I think, into thinking that it was easier than it was. And many had mountain sickness, and they died of oedema and heart conditions. 8 died on the mountain while I was there. But for the rest, Buddhist and Hindu, this is the ascent of the mountain is the trajectory of redemption. There's a place called Shivatsal there, which is a cemetery. But it's a cemetery not for bodies, but for clothes. People just discard their clothes there as a kind of token to Yama, the god of death, to look kindly on them when their next reincarnation occurs. And so this strange cemetery has clothing the builders, or simply lying around. And sometimes one finds people actually practicing their death there. They will lie down and imagine their death and try to become familiar with it, sometimes under the tutelage of a holy man. While I was there, just sitting there, a bundle of rags rose to its feet and turned out to be an old man who had been just practicing his death, and he grinned at me and walked on. So you climb on through an icy wind, and I could now, at almost 19,000 feet, take no more than about 10 paces. Of course, you fear altitude sickness at such a height. Altitude sickness is no respect of age, gender, fitness, anything. It strikes one person and leaves another alone. I was lucky. My Sherpa, quaintly, was not. He got bad headaches, and I was exhausted, but all right. As you approach 18,600 feet, you come close to the summit of the pass, and this is sacred to Tara, the goddess of compassion. The gales that flow through the pass have toppled the great prayer flags in enormous heaps over the vast boulder, which is sacred to the goddess. And only by stumbling round that among the prayer flags and parting them, you could see on the stone people had written mantra. Some had left teeth or little of their own blood or their hair on the stone as a symbol of their passing. An infectious sense of victory went up. Shamans were shouting victory to the gods. The Hindus were quietly taking their prasad. The Buddhists were meditating before going down on the very steep further side. But you may wonder, of course, what in fact is being redeemed. It's essentially, of course, it's depersonalized karma. There's no individual survival and no memory. This is a grander and less intense tradition than we're used to in Europe, of course, in which what matters is not the individual, but the weight of good or evil that is carried into the world after they've gone. It's a world, moreover, of course, that to Hindus is cyclical, that will return again and again. In a celebrated passage of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna addresses Arjuna the archer before battle. He says, "Thou hast mourned those who should not be mourned, nor at any moment was I not, nor thou, nor these kings, and not at all shall we ever come not to be." So these two warriors pass into battle and hew men down with those exalted smiles of the half smiles of Hindu gods, for they know they're killing nothing of importance. In fact, the erasure of the individual is the condition of salvation. My Buddhist monk friend in Kathmandu insisted that Buddhism is not a religion. He said, it's not even a philosophy, it's a science. At its highest level, he said, it's a technique of true realization. As he told me, we have no God, we have no soul. This, of course, offers little comfort to somebody from the European tradition who desire or believe that memory may survive, human characteristics may survive, and even human appearance. But, as the Buddhists say, from all that he loves, man must part. In conclusion, very briefly, I prefer to leave you with an account of my first sighting of Mount Kailash. I was approaching here momentarily by Land Rover from the Tibetan border. As we climb higher, the sky goes light and thin. Here and there, a monastery stands in the wastes, and nomad flocks are grazing on nothing under the far mountains. Then, at 16,000 feet, we crest the Thalodong Pass and come to a stupefied halt. We are gazing on a country of planetary strangeness. Beneath us, in a crescent of depthless silence, a huge lake curves empty out of sight. It is utterly still. In the plateau's barren smoothness, it makes a hard purity, like some elemental carving, and its color is almost shocking, a violent peacock blue. There's no bird or wind-touched shrub to start a sound. And in the cleansed stillness, high above, floating on foothills, so faded that it seems isolated in the sky, shines the cone of Mount Kailash. In this heart-stopping moment, pilgrims burst into cries and prayer. There seem no colors left in the world but this bare earth brown, the snow is white, and the sheen of mirrored sky. Everything else has been distilled away. The south face of Kailash is fluted with the illusion of a long vertical stairway, as if for spirits to climb by. It shines 50 miles away in unearthly solitude. Void of any life, the whole region might have survived from some sacred prehistory, shorn of human complication. We have entered Holy Land. Thank you very much.
That was lovely, thank you. I have only one question, I think, before I throw it open to the audience, who I'm sure will have plenty more. You know, the sort of the atmosphere, the aura around Mount Kailash, because of sort of the religious practices and the history associated with it, uh, seems to almost invite meditations on life and death and the meaning of life. And you went to Kailash in a state of mind that was sort of bordering on sorrow, that was discombobulated in some way, that you were sort of unsettled by the loss of your mother and of the rest of your family over the previous years. In what state of mind did you return from Kailash? What did Kailash do to you?
I wish I could say that I had had some sort of epiphany, some great spiritual healing of some kind. It wasn't quite like that. I think I never expected it to be. The curious thing I think that happened to me was that I came in contact with another tradition than my own. Of course, like anybody, almost anybody in England, I was brought up in a Christian tradition.
Right.
And whether or not we believe in an afterlife, whatever we believe, to come in contact with the Buddhist Hindu tradition, which is basically saying that the individual doesn't matter that much, that you yourself don't matter that much, is quite cleansing, as not necessarily anything you might believe in, but as a possibility.
Right.
And I found that in some way stilled me and made a bit of a difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to the audience. I think there's a bunch of questions there. We'll get mics to you, so if you could just stand up and ask your question, that would be perfect. Anyway, I mean, whoever has a mic.
Do you think, I'm over here, do you think Kailash will ever be climbed by anybody? A rogue climbing group or a Chinese sanctioned expedition?
Well, I wonder. There have been rumors that climbers have got there covertly, but it would be a dangerous thing to do if they were seen up there and it's very exposed. There are plenty of angry Buddhists and Hindus waiting a little bit below. I don't know. It's hard to imagine that every mountain in the world won't be climbed at some stage. And I know Reinhold Messner, the great Italian-Swiss mountaineer, did apply to the Chinese to climb it. And he was about to do it, I think. But then he realized how unpopular, to say the least, this was going to be, how he was violating something. And he backed down. And I think the Chinese have now refused permission to anybody that wants to climb it. It's perfectly climbable. I mean, it looks austere, but there's one side of it that could be scaled. There were one or two people during the British period of some sort of ascendancy in the area who did try to climb it, but they came to grief. One old fellow sort of tried to climb it with a rolled up umbrella and a bowler hat, and he didn't make it. So I don't know the answer to your question really, except that as far as I know, nobody has yet climbed it.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Colin, it's a great honor to see you today. I've read all your books. I thought the book on Siberia in particular was a masterpiece. But I'd just like to ask you, because you've been to so many remote places, do you feel a sense of sadness or despair that some of these cultures have been vanquished, some are in the process of being vanquished? How does that sit with you? Obviously about a number of places, but perhaps Tibet in particular.
I'm so sorry, I rather lost the question. Did you hear?
Sort of about the vanquishment of cultures.
How do you feel about
Tibet
the fact that some of the places you've visited, the cultures have been vanquished or are in the processes of being, they've changed dramatically, both with modernization, war, time?
The Tibetan culture is being vanquished, were you thinking?
Well, other places as well where things have changed so exponentially over many decades.
Well,
since you visited them.
It's a huge question. In the case of this journey, yes, I think the the beating heart of Tibet is its monasteries, and every monastery has a communist sort of section in a little quango supervising what they do. But the most damaging, I think, that has sort of eviscerated Buddhism in Tibet is that old tradition of teacher to student has been severed, particularly for those serious monks who want to meditate, which is a very esoteric practice, and you need a teacher. The teachers are vital, and that's something that has been damaged very badly under the Chinese. I don't know, I couldn't quite get the rest of your question, whether it was cultures in general that I felt.
Yeah, I mean, some of the erosion of cultures, I guess, by maybe more dominant cultures, and whether you feel a certain sadness or what you feel when you revisit some of these places.
I'm sorry, yes, I didn't get all of your questions. Yes, of course I feel sad to see. I like variety, and that's why travel writers go, of course, is to see difference. And I like differences in language, culture. The more differences there seem to be, the more possibilities there seem to be of the way we live and what we believe in. So it always makes me sad to see a culture beginning to go almost extinct, as we are seeing perhaps now among some of the Christian peoples of the Middle East.
Yes, over here in the middle, there's a bunch of people near the aisle.
It's heartening to learn from you that we can't now swim at Manasarovar and can't take a boat there. Is that the rule that you mentioned? Because in '85 when I went there, we were swimming around and we had a rubber boat there, and the whole philosophy of Manasarovar is to lie on your back there and meditate on your inside through your nabhi, the belly button, and that's where the Brahma's lotus comes out from. So did you check on why these the Hindu traditions to bathe in Manasarovars have been eroded? I mean, did you check why these rules and regulations have taken away the liberty of really living there? Swami Parvanand in his book really recommends that he would like to see travelers coming there and having a picnic. So did you challenge this to the Chinese government or the Buddhist monks?
He says he's bathed and boated around in Manasarovar in the lake, and whether the rules have changed at some point. This was in the mid-'80s, I believe, and so maybe when you went, had they gotten stricter about what you could do?
It's possible. I never saw any boat on Manasarovar or anybody fishing, anybody swimming in it. I don't know. I've never heard of anybody actually sailing a boat there, except way back in the late 19th century. So I don't know the answer to your question, I'm afraid, except that those who I did see wading into the water were pious Hindus who were, of course, praying.
Okay, yes sir, over here.
I am planning to go in the next June, and I'm 60. So are there any tips you would like to give us?
Colin would, do you have tips for traveling there?
Well, I would go with plenty of hope. I did it when I was 70, so it's perfectly possible. What I would say is, I did find that people were doing it who were really ill-advised to do it. They weren't fit enough. I would have proper medical checks. In India now, the government, if you go on a government quota, will impose medical checks for you to go. But there are other, I think, unscrupulous tour operators in this country who will persuade you that you don't really need a medical check, or it doesn't matter, or that it's all very easy. It's not easy. It's tough climbing. The worst, it's lack of oxygen that really gets people, and that's the danger. It's very tiring. And I would recommend, I think, probably going some of the way on a horse. It depends how fit you are. But don't take it lightly, but go. It's wonderful.
Okay?
We have a question at the front here, and then
Yes,
let's
sir.
take one from the back.
Yes, sir.
If I could just ask you to say a little bit, or your comment, that the monks believe that the soul has no memory. Because I have heard a contrary theory that the soul survives for 7 generations. And for the first generation, the dead are quite in touch, watching over their flock below. But that, of course, couldn't happen if they have no memory. So I'd be interested if you could inform us any more on this.
It's a very good question, very interesting. And of course, just as there are many forms and beliefs within Christianity, so there are within Buddhism. And I've heard just such a phenomenon as you speak of. Similarly, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are tales of, when they create a new Dalai Lama, it's because they imagine that the infant who they have selected has recognized the clothes of a previous Dalai Lama. So there's some memory going on. And similarly, there are all sorts of tales of people, suddenly remembering a previous life that are quite common in ordinary Tibetan culture. But I think that classical Buddhism, what you would call it, would not follow those theories. But as you've rightly said, there are different strands and beliefs. But on the whole, quite unlike the Christian tradition, where the soul is said to retain memory, appearance, everything, the Buddhist is left behind.
We have time for 2 more questions. Let's go to the back somewhere if somebody has a question. Yes, sir.
Hello. Mr. Thubron, I'm interested in knowing what is the one thing about Tibetan Buddhism that drew your attention towards it at the first place? And my second question is, your journey to the Kailash and to the Himalayas, how did that help you deal with the loss of your dear ones?
Well, I think the second part you did answer. You said
Yes.
that there was a cleansing that you experienced. But what about the first part? What was it about Tibetan Buddhism that drew you there in the first place?
I think like almost all Westerners, Europeans, I'd read terribly little about Tibetan Buddhism. Virtually the only book that people would be expected to have read was the Book of the Dead, which I had read, and which is an extraordinary document, which it's possible because of the sort of mixture of exactitude and science, that to imagine that this has quite a potent reality to it. I think, in fact, that it's a much later and more suspect book than popularly it's supposed to have been. But that was the first germ, I suppose, of my thinking, that this was an extraordinary and potent form of Buddhism. But I started in great ignorance and ended with respect and a little more knowledge.
And one last question. Yes, sir, the gentleman here, you've had your hand up.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a very riveting account. It calls memories back of 2009 trek that I did to Kailash. But that was as the Indian government organized tour. It takes you along the Kali River, Indo-Nepal border, and gradually acclimatizes, so takes care of a lot of acclimatization issues which have been flagged here. And you gradually enter Tibet at 5,200 meters, the Lipu Lake Pass. My question to you, yes, thank you for pointing that out, is, the Rakshas Tal and the Manasarovar Tal. Have you wondered about the origins? So one of the theories, and I'm just trying to pick your brains on this, is when the Indian plate collided with the Asian plate, and the Himalayas rose up, and the Gondwana land went back. So, and you had the sea in between, which was called, now known as the Tethys Sea. So, any comments, reflections on the origin of lake, and a possibility that the lake has emanated from the Tethys Sea, part of the sea that got trapped and resulted in birth of the rivers?
I mean, you'd mentioned that the lake came out of the mind of the creator. But if you were to assume the hat of a geologist for a minute, do you know where the lake came from?
Yes, no, I think you're probably right that, when the Indian subcontinent hit the bottom of what we think of as Asia now and pushed up the Himalayas, which are quite a young range, that Manasarovar and others, Rakashtal, were the isolated remains, very likely, of the Tethys Sea. I'm not sure anybody's quite sure of this, how it'd be hard to be, but that is, that's so. And thank you for mentioning that the Indian government also has been sending people up the Kanali River as I went, because it is a slow accommodation and better. But those strange lakes there, they do look as if they've been left over from some ancient tectonic shift. And it's fascinating to think that the Himalayas are in fact still rising. They're not static. They are inching up with the ancient impact of the continent that impacted southern Asia. In fact, mountaineers tend to say you better climb the Himalayas quick before they get any taller.
Colin, Thubron, thank you so much for an excellent talk. We really learned a lot, and thank you all for your questions.
Thank you.